Hello everyone and welcome to my little corner of the internet. My name's Michael and I'm bitten by a radioactive book. Today we're continuing our guide to fantasy and this week's topic is military fantasy. Now, military is a term that comes out of science fiction because military science fiction has a huge tradition in the SF field. In fantasy, it's not that common. You might even debate if it is a real genre or subgenre of fantasy, because there are only a few number of books that really consists of military fantasy, and most of them can be linked toward other fantasy subgenres as well, like grimdark, flintlock fantasy, or epic fantasy. But I think there are some really interesting and unique themes here in this kind of military subgenre, and these are worth exploring on their own. So one element of military fantasy is of course military technology. And one of the things about military fantasy is that we're looking into how fantasy weapons and fantastical elements would influence war. How would war look if we had like magical powers? How would war like if we had fantastical creatures like dragons, for example? How would war look like if there would be actual help from the gods? So what military SF does with technology is what military fantasy does with this fantastical element, to see how war might be influenced by such elements. Of course, related to our own history, fantasy takes a lot of influence from historical battles. So military fantasy can be a kind of bridge into looking what historical battles looked like for the people who were involved there. Because even if you have this kind of technology elements in there or the strategy elements in there, military fantasy is basically a story of characters and how characters deal with war and how war looked for the characters. And of course that in this first direct meaning is how looked war for characters in the age of steel, or in case of flintlock fantasy, in the age of muskets. And this is of course also something that relates then to our own view of what war does to people, and this is something that is still a current issue, because we have so many wars in the world at the moment, and for a lot of people suffering through war, this is kind of a reality. And a lot of military science fiction authors are actually people who served in the Vietnam War and then started to write their own experiences of this war down to show the cruelties of war. So military fantasy is often kind of anti-war literature, because it shows the cruelties that war does to people, and shows in the end that war is not about fighting for ideologies or fighting for countries, but for the people who are in it. It's more like fighting to survive for themselves and for the people who are in their immediate vicinity. That is why a huge element of military fantasy literature is based on like groups of soldiers, like squads or whole companies, and how the relationships are between the soldiers, because these relationships, the friendship the soldiers make, the loyalty they feel to each other as a person, as a human being, are really the things that drive them forward. And most often the moral we find in military fantasy is that the things that are worth fighting for are more often very personally motivated, as in comparison to being motivated, by some kind of ideology. And next to the element of technology and the personal motivation and the experiences of the soldier, we are also looking at literature about hierarchy and structures of hierarchy, because the military offers a very strict structure. You have like the different levels and ranks of the soldiers. Orders have to be passed down through the chain of command, and it's very important that these orders are carried out in the way that they are meant. So so looking at this kind of command structure, and also of communication, and maybe even of communication between different social groups, because normally in a lot of military fantasy, as in our own history, the people serving on the ground level were more like commoners, workers, and the people who are officers were more often nobility or very educated people. So you don't only have this look at the hierarchy structure, but also within it a bit of looking at how different social groups communicate with each other, and where some conflicts in social groups arise as well. Having all those groups confined in this strict hierarchy system within the sandbox of an army structure is also a really sociological experiment as well. So you get a lot of insight into how structures work, and that relates a bit to how our society works as well. We also have these structures. They are not as strict as directly in the military, but in some of modern days companies you get the feeling of being just like a grunt on the low level, and then you have your supervisor and he has his supervisor, and in the end you have the people at the top of the chain of command that would be the ones that giving out the like company mission statement and basic ideology of the company, just like maybe a king giving orders to his army and basing that on his ideology. And so this kind of army background is a very interesting sociological structure as well. So if you read a military fantasy, these are the kind of themes you can expect, how people deal with the cruelties of war, how they find their own motivations for fighting, and how they behave inside a very strict sociological structure like an army. Now let's head into the recommendation section of this part. First off, I want to talk about The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. The Heroes is a standalone novel set in Abercrombie's First Law universe. And if you already know the First Law trilogy, you will know that there is like the Union and the North, and they are in a constant battle. The Union consists of a more civilized Western society, and the North are more like a barbaric society. And these nations clash in the First Law trilogy, and they also clash in The Heroes. And The Heroes takes a different approach because it focuses on one big battle, one conflict that goes on for a few days, and how the battle evolves is shown from both sides of the conflicts. And the title, The Heroes, of course, if you know Joe Abercrombie, you will know there are no actually heroes in there, in this book, and you see actually what makes people like heroes, and that this whole heroism thing is something that, yeah, is not real, but more of a propaganda kind of thing. It's a very interesting take. It's a bit like reading maybe something like the Battle of Gettysburg. That's also yeah, a conflict evolving over a course of a few days, and seeing that kind of conflict from both sides of the conflict. And yeah, that's very, very interesting. Next up we have Of Bone and Thunder by Chris Evans. Some of you might already know this because I reviewed this book a couple of weeks ago. It's a book that is very closely related to the Vietnam War and shows us how the Vietnam War kind of scenario would work out in fantasy. So instead of people running around with guns in the jungle, we have people running around with crossbows. Instead of being flown into battle with helicopters, they are flown into battle on the backs of huge black dragons, and the whole atmosphere is really, really well researched in this novel. You get a lot about the relationships of the soldiers that are basically never really seeing their enemy, because their enemy is always like hidden in the brush, and what that does to their psyche. There's drug abuse in there, for example, and yeah, the whole thing is really, really close to the actual Vietnam War. Next up we have The 10,000 by Paul Kearney. The 10,000 is also a series that is based on military and battle. We have armies, and we're looking really into the ground level of the armies. We have a scenario that reminds a bit of the Roman Empire, and so many people who are on the ground level are not there of their own free will, but because they are slaves. And we're looking into this, how it is to fight from a slave's point of view. And of course, as I mentioned before, that one of the themes is in military fantasy is that people are more finding personal reasons to fight. And you can imagine, if you are a slave, yeah, you're not really inclined to fight for your slavers. So to actually do it kind of well, you have to find something of your own to fight. And I would expect that this is, yeah, something that you will see in this novel as well. Next up we have Deeds of Paxonarion by Elizabeth Moon. Here we have a very interesting view into military life, because the protagonist is a female, and I think this is the scenario where a woman pretends to be a man to be in the military. If you have seen my Guide to Flintlock Fantasy, we have this in Django Wexler's The Thousand Names as well. And here, yeah, we're having a young woman inside an army, and it's very interesting to see her female perspective of this life between men who are going to fight. And the series by Elizabeth Moon is a very famous fantasy series, maybe a second rank or second grade fantasy series, not so known, but if you're into fantasy, you will most likely have heard the name before. And as I said, there are many other series that belong to maybe other genres of fantasy, but that tie in also with the military theme. I won't go into them into too much detail, but you have seen me talk about the Malazan Book of the Fallen a lot. You have seen me talk about The Black Company by Glenn Cook in the segment about grimdark fantasy. Both have a heavy focus on military and military units as well. The Flintlock fantasy, as you can see in the guide, is basically very often connected to military fantasy. So books like the mentioned The Thousand Names by Django Wexler, Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan, or His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik are also great examples of military fantasy. But I've shown them and talked about them in other guides more in depth, but to just show you what is out there as well and how they are connected to other genres, yeah, I wanted to mention them. So that's it for this week's guide. Next week we are going to conclude our guide to fantasy with the last part being about dark fantasy. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it and seeing you there. I hope you enjoyed this guide. If you did, hit the like button. If you want to see more of me, subscribe to my channel. If you want to know what's coming up on my channel, please look inside the description box. There's a little segment there called On the Horizon. I wish you a good day and hope you get bitten by a really good book too. Bye.